is really what we do. So we are happy to be here. We're happy you are here. Over the past 11 years, we have reached hundreds and hundreds of people on campus, in Lexington, and across the Bluegrass. But tonight, I am excited because we have watch parties around the state who have come to hear tonight's speaker. And so in addition to welcoming you here tonight, I also want to welcome our partners in Paducah at West Kentucky Community and Technical College, our partners in Marshall County at Marshall County Extension Office, and then in Eastern County, or in Eastern Kentucky, we have Hazard Community and Technical College in Hazard in Perry County. And last but not least, we have Collin Community Center in Harlan County. So this really is a statewide event, and we are absolutely thrilled that we're able to pull this off. This is the first time that we've done anything like this. And it's perfectly fitting then that we get to introduce the speaker that we have today, who really has had impacts far beyond Kentucky, but certainly within the state quite extensively. And so as UPI's first statewide seminar and as our pre-Tree Week event, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Chris Barton. So Dr. Barton is a professor of hydrology and watershed management at UK Department of Forestry. His research includes water resources, ecosystem restoration, remediation of streams, wetlands, and mined lands. Dr. Barton currently serves on the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine's Committee on Earth Resources, and recently he was named a Fulbright Distinguished Chair, which is quite a distinguished position. But importantly, Dr. Barton is also the founder and the president of Green Forests Work, a nonprofit that aims to improve the environment and economy of mined landscapes. Through Green Forests Work, over 8 million trees have been planted on mine lands in Appalachia as well as in Australia, and over 30,000 volunteers have been participants. And so there's quite an impressive record that Dr. Barton brings to us. So the title of his talk tonight is Bringing Back the Forests, Ecological Restoration Provides Opportunities for Mining Regions of the World. So please join me in welcoming Chris.
Thank you. Oh. No, thank you for that introduction. What I wanted to do today was talk a little bit about a program that I developed to look at basically restoring the ecology and the economy of areas that have been impacted by mining in Appalachia, and how I attempted through this Fulbright scholarship to take this regional reforestation program and apply it globally to other mining regions of the world. And let's try this. So one of the reasons I got interested in this was due to a report that came out by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And they reported that an increase of 1 billion hectares of forest on Earth could limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C by 2050, and thereby prevent a climate crisis. So I read that and I was like, 1 billion hectares. And if we plant about 1,000 trees per hectare, that ends up being 1 trillion trees. So I was like, where in the world would you plant 1 trillion trees on this earth? Well, it turns out that a lot of people were thinking about that. And so we know that there are places that you're probably not going to plant 1 trillion trees. Deserts, ice caps, rock outcrops. So we can take those off the list of places on Earth to plant trees. We have issues with global food security across the globe. So productive agricultural lands probably wouldn't be a very good place to convert into forest. We certainly need more trees in urban environments, but when we're thinking a trillion trees, that's probably not the first place we would think of for a huge global effort on reforestation. And as we've all experienced in the last few years, with issues with wildfires, planting trees in this sort of urban rural interface might be an issue as well. So there was a study, there's been several studies now that have been done using GIS and remote sensing to sort of figure out where in the world you could plant those billion trees. So one of the first studies that came out was by Barton and Associates in 2019 in the journal Science. And they located 0.9 billion hectares on Earth that would be suitable for reforestation. Well, a lot of other people read that paper and they were like, I don't know. He included like important wetlands, important prairie lands, and things of that nature. So there was a lot of criticism about this. So this Strasbourg group redid their own analysis, taking out some of these areas of importance, and they came up with 0.6 billion hectares. So a little bit better. They published that in Nature. And then just a few months ago in the journal Nature Communications, Fesenmeyer reported about 0.2 billion hectares. So we're getting a little bit smaller, but it's still a large amount of land on this globe where we could potentially plant trees. But one of the things that all three of those studies showed was that marginal and disturbed lands are probably the best area that we could look at for large-scale global reforestation. And all three of them also identified two things. The temperate forest region of America's South and East had the largest potential in North America. And the tropical East Coast of Australia also had the highest potential in that country. And when I saw that, I was like, the light bulb went off. I was like, ooh, that makes sense. Because I know that there's a lot of disturbed landscapes within both of those areas. So here's a picture from Pike County, Kentucky. This is an active surface mine. And one of the things, I'm losing my, I got it back. One of the things you'll notice about this picture, this is an active surface mine, but if you look at the edge or the back of this picture, it's forested. So most of the lands that were mined for coal in Appalachia were forested prior to the mining. A similar sort of situation in Australia, different type of forest, a little more savanna-like. But again, this picture from the Bowen Basin shows very clearly that there are some similarities in these two countries. And again, on the edge of this particular site, you see forest. So that's what really got me thinking about this sort of connectivity of Appalachia to other regions of the world. And so when I think about the Appalachian forest, this picture kind of comes into my mind. Here we have a very rugged, very biodiverse. Some people consider it the most biodiverse temperate forest in the world. It's a really important migratory corridor because it has this north-south orientation. It's really supported a lot of livelihoods. A lot of people have lived here. A lot of people have lived off the land. And to me, it's just a very important resource. But it has a long history of natural resource extraction. We know from the industrial timber era of the late 1800s, early 1900s, that much of Appalachia was logged. And then around the 1950s to present, we have another type of disturbance, and that is surface mining for coal. And as this little video kind of shows, drastically alters the landscape when we go in and surface mine an area for coal mining. So this picture kind of shows the process of what happens to one of these sites. During the mining process, one of the first things that happen is all the vegetation gets taken off and pushed generally down into a valley, lots of times burned. Then they start this process of extracting the rock off the top of the coal seams, as the picture shows. They'll extract that coal out, and then they'll blow off the rock till they get to the next seam, and so on and so forth. And in lots of areas, you might have 5 different seams of coal that they may account during that process. So we had that picture of what surface mining or Appalachia looked like prior to surface mining. And here's an example, a pretty good example of what it looks like after the mining. So you can see a very different landscape in this picture. The first thing I notice is that the rugged topography is gone. It's now relatively flat. But there are some other things that this picture shows that are very important. Almost all of the mine sites, surface mine sites in Appalachia prior to mining, were forested. And there are very few trees on this landscape. And this has become a big problem with these sites. They're forested prior, they're deforested, and they're brought back into a grassland type of post-mining land use. And the reason that that has happened is it's really related to some of our environmental policy and laws that regulate surface mining. And in 1977, the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act was passed. And prior to that, there were a lot of issues with landslides, a lot of issues of rocks going through people's houses, a lot of water quality issues. So there was a huge emphasis in that law to put these sites back to what they called the proximate original contour. And so to achieve that, you have to take the biggest bulldozer you can find and repeatedly grade that material until it gets some sort of resemblance of a hill. And in the process of doing that, you are heavily compacting that soil. The other part of the problem is the original soil that was there prior to the mining gets buried. And so in Appalachia, the law also states is if your original topsoil has low productivity or is not very thick, then you can use a topsoil substitute. And so that pretty much meant everybody's using a topsoil substitute, which in this case is just that blasted up rock that we saw from the earlier picture. So we're replacing the soil with something that doesn't have the original nutrients, the original soil fauna, the mycorrhizae, all of these things that are beneficial for a forest soil, not to mention that all the original native seed is buried. So these things get planted into something that will grow on that compacted rocky soil, and that turns out to be a lot of non-native species like Lespedisa, Kentucky fescue, all sorts of different clovers that are not necessarily, native to this region. And so because of the compaction, because of the non-soil, because of those chemical conditions, and because the things that they do plant out there are very competitive with our native vegetation, we see these sites in a state like this for 20, 30, 40 years after the mining. And so we refer to this as a state of arrested succession. They aren't following a natural succession process that we would expect, say, an old field if we just left it alone. We kind of know that it'll eventually, yeah, in some cases, maybe not, but we would expect it to turn back into an area that has native vegetation. So this is a big problem. And we did a study years ago to look at what is the extent of mining in Appalachia. And what we found out was there are about 700,000 hectares of land that has been mined and the bond has been released. So the mining company is no longer liable for anything on that site. And there are about 300,000 hectares that are currently permitted for mining in the Appalachian region. So we're looking at 1 million hectares of land. That's a land mass bigger than the state of Delaware, a landmass bigger than the state of Rhode Island, and nearly as big as those two states combined. So 1 million hectares, that's 1 billion trees potentially that we could plant on them. So at least in North America, if we were looking for a place to plant a lot of trees, here's your #1 location, in my opinion. Unfortunately, though, based upon some of those things I just mentioned of why these things are in a state of arrested succession, they're just not that easy to go out and pop a tree in the ground, walk away and expect it to be a forest one day. They're highly disturbed. They have physical and chemical limitations. I already mentioned they're compacted. The original soil's gone. So in some cases you might have alkaline soils, other cases you might have acidic soils. They have low fertility. They have almost no organic matter. There are water issues associated with these sites. There are habitat issues associated with these sites. So we had to develop some sort of research program to go out and figure out how in the world we're going to get trees to grow on these sites before we start thinking about large scale reforestation. So one of the first projects that happened in Eastern Kentucky was at the Starfire mine in Perry County. And this project started in 1997. And what the goal of the project was we wanted the mining company to go out and set up a site that, following the rules, following the laws, how they thought it should be created, and then we'll plant trees on it. And then we came up with another technique, a low compaction reclamation technique, because we knew that the compaction was one of the primary issues with trees growing in this site. So again, we told the mining company, get the site prepared, how you think it needs to be prepared, by the law. And then the last 8 feet of material in your dump truck, dump it in piles that are like really closely abutted to each other. And then take a bulldozer and knock the top of those piles off. So what we did was essentially created a raised bed out on this mine site. And then we planted the same number of trees in each one of these cells. So 2,541 trees in individual species blocks. There was 8 different species that were planted: white oak, red oak, yellow poplar, all native to Eastern Kentucky. And then we kind of watched them grow. So at year 19, after they were planted, the conventional reclamation had 23% survival. The low compaction reclamation had 80% survival. And at year 10, actually, we went in and did a sort of a statistical analysis comparing the height of these trees and the diameter of these trees to regenerating forests that were growing on the Daniel Boone National Park forest, where trees had been logged. And so comparing these trees to those that were naturally regenerating, we found that statistically, the conventional reclamation growth was well below that of what we would expect a regenerating forest of the same age to be. Whereas the low compaction reclamation actually had statistically similar growth to the regenerating forest at the same age. So if we can get 80% survival and good growth, then we're doing something right. So the interesting thing about the 19-year survival on conventional reclamation, there was one tree that had like 70% survival or higher. It was white ash. And 2 years later, every one of them died because of the emerald ash borer. So now the survival there is probably like 5%. But this was a really good sort of experiment to demonstrate what just alleviating that compaction problem can do to help restore these forests. And we probably toured, I'd say, well over 20,000 people on these plots. And just walking through there, you don't have to have a single bit of scientific information, just looking at it. You can see that something right is going on there. So again, that site was planted in 97. Here's some NRES students in summer camp going out to measure some of these trees in 2014. Here's an aerial of that site in 2016, so 19 years old, the same age that we did the survey. Here's 2019, and these trees in the plots and all of these trees that you see out there were planted by my team, and a lot of them are over 50 feet tall now and just doing really well. And you can see the active line in the background. So we did a lot of these demonstrations. I don't have time to go into it, but we demonstrated over and over that we could successfully get these trees to grow if we mitigated the compaction, if we used the right type of topsoil material. Turns out that all rock is not the same, and so there's certain types of rock we would prefer over others. One of the things that we looked at, going back to this whole climate change mitigation strategy, is the capability of these sites for sequestering carbon. When we start off with a soil that has no carbon in it, there's a huge potential to gain carbon in that system, and that's exactly what we found. By year 18, we had sequestered 4 metric tons per hectare per year on these sites. Now, if you went into a cornfield and converted that into a forest, you might, if you're lucky, get 1 metric ton per hectare per year because there's already carbon in the soil. So you're not really building it up. And that's one of the things that we found on these sites, is that you built up that soil carbon and actually developed those soils very rapidly. So that was at the plot level. We wondered, can we do this at a watershed level? So this is the Guy Cove watershed in Breathitt County, Kentucky. And this is a valley fill. So there used to be a stream that ran down the middle of this valley. You can see that a lot of the side slopes and the top has been denuded and all that pushed into that valley. Each one of these lifts that you see is about 50 feet. So there's about 125 feet of material above what the original stream was. So Dr. Carmen Agaritas, who's in biosystems and ag engineering, and myself came up with this idea of, can we restore the stream in this system and restore the whole watershed? So we went and actually got permission to do this and dug out about 150,000 yards of material that had been buried over that stream. We put in a new stream, dug it in. We took that material that was buried in the fill and we put it back on the side slopes in a very sort of loose configuration to try to minimize the compaction. And then we planted about 50,000 trees in that watershed. So here's the stream restored. We daylighted the stream, which was very, fulfilling actually to see something that had been buried come back to life. And then very quick amount of time, we saw that this watershed was restoring itself. So this was 10 years after we planted the trees. We had really good canopy cover, and these are all native trees, hardwood trees that we planted. And here's that same site in 2024. We now have canopy coverage out there. You can walk in the shade, which is always a nice thing in the summer. The stream is flowing more normal. It kind of dries up in the summer, which is what a lot of headwater streams in Appalachia do. It's supporting a rich assemblage of macroinvertebrates. We got documented salamanders utilizing that stream. So it's not perfect. I will never say that it's perfect, but at least it's something better, and at least it's more similar to what the pre-mining condition is. And as I'm getting older, unfortunately, I have a lot more of examples of these sorts of things. On the left here is a site in Knott County. This is one of my former grad students. We planted that in 2005. And I happened to be on the same site last year filming some sort of thing for Kentucky Life. And I was like, this place looks familiar. And I was like, oh, I planted this. And so I'm standing in the middle of a big grove of white oak trees that we planted, and it looked fantastic. On the right, another example, in 2011, we ripped up a site up in West Virginia for red spruce restoration. A few years later, we have, red spruce that are just doing phenomenal. So Unfortunately, I'm getting older. Fortunately, the forests are actually starting to develop. So through that program, that sort of initial research program, one of the things we try to do is document all the benefits of this reforestation. And so I'm a water quality guy, so we definitely looked at water quality issues, how bringing back the forest also increases biodiversity. Um, we looked at these sites for other opportunities or other initiatives in the region, for planting American chestnut, for red spruce restoration, for shortleaf pine restoration, for white oak restoration. All of these are big reforestation initiatives in the Appalachian region. And there's no reason why we can't do these sorts of things on these mine sites because they will successfully grow all of these trees. And wildlife habitat improvement is a big driver of the work that we do. And more recently, we're starting to look at the role of bringing back the forest on mitigating floods. As we've had all of these recent floods in 2022 and this year in the Appalachian region, we know that the trees are important for canopy interception, for evapotranspiration of the water. So having those sites in a compacted state with no trees on them is only going to accelerate surface runoff and flooding. So bringing back the forest is actually a very good thing to do for flash flood mitigation. So once we have established this research program, in about the year 2009, President Obama gave his first address to the nation. And one of the things he focused on in his address was green jobs, green energy, green this, green that. And so Appalachia at that time was sort of in transition. We were starting to see a lot of the big coal minings, shut down. And um, and at that time, we kind of looked back and it was like, wait a minute, we have, like this 1,000,000 hectares of land that was been mined and reclaimed as a grassland. And so maybe there's an opportunity there to build some sort of green jobs program around, restoration. And so we kind of thought of it as a regenerative economy for the region. And so this is when we developed the Green Forest Work idea. And this was, a reforestation program to stimulate the economy and the environment of Appalachia, plant millions of trees on thousands of hectares of mine land, create those green jobs, and also empower local citizens to restore their landscapes. And because there's a lot of issues with many of these mine sites, and they do need some help. So why Appalachia? Well, again, the coal economy was drying up, and this is actually a 2025 map, but this shows the economically distressed counties in Appalachia. And if you look where all of these red counties are, they're kind of right in the heart of the coal field. So we knew that if we could stimulate the economy in these areas through these reforestation restoration projects, that it could have an effect on the local economy. So how are we going to do that? So to do the work that we need to do to restore these sites, we need equipment and we need equipment operators. Well, a lot of those people are available in that area. A lot of them actually worked on the mine lands and can be utilized to do that work. We pay people to collect native seed. We take that native seed and take it to local nurseries and greenhouses, and they grow it up, and then we buy it back from them. And then we pay tree planters to plant these things out in the field. There's money associated with monitoring and maintenance, invasive species control, things of that nature with these sites long term. There are training opportunities with these programs. And sometime down the road, there's going to be forest products associated with these sites, increased potentially of tourism to these areas. And ultimately, we always thought maybe there might be a carbon market at some point in time, but that has yet to show its face. So a big part of what we need to do out on the landscape is mitigate all that compaction. So we're hiring, armies of bulldozer operators, excavator operators, to go out and simply plow up the land. And it seems to be a very effective approach for turning these sites around, breaking that arrested succession. So since we started in 2009, we have had about 15,000 acres that we've restored, somewhere between 25 and 30,000 volunteers. We're just under 8 million trees planted so far, and we have projects in 8 states of the United States and both in Queensland and New South Wales and Australia. A lot of the volunteerism is done by college students. We've had over 80 colleges and universities bring students to Appalachia to plant trees, usually during spring break. And it's really a great way to talk about the issue of what the effects of these practices are on the environment, but also what you can do as an individual to come out and actually make the situation better. So these events are always very popular, and it's something that they're a lot of work, but it's something that we really enjoy doing. So when you're planting trees on a mine site, you need all the help you can get, and we've asked for it from everywhere. We've blessed the ground in places, we've blessed the trees, we've serenaded the trees. We actually have held a smoke ceremony where you basically, frighten the bad spirits away from the land, which probably can be needed on some of these mine sites. And being from Kentucky, we've toasted the trees on many occasions. And that impact is, it's occurring. And you can see this sort of timeline of how the number of trees we have been planting has grown. Over the last 5 years, we planted approximately 1 million trees each year. And if you look at the map here, we planted trees in over 90 counties in Appalachia. So Pennsylvania, Ohio, Maryland, West Virginia, Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama. And we've also planted some in some other places. Just real quick, I wanted to sort of talk about a little case study of one project and what kind of impact it can make. And this is the Mauer Track project at Sheep Mountain in West Virginia. And this is a really large scale restoration project that's been going on for 15 years. We have lots of goals here: restore the native red spruce forest ecosystem, decompact the soils, add organic matter to the soils, work on changing the surface runoff and forcing the water to infiltrate and purify by going into the soil, increase biodiversity on that system by not only planting trees, but also native seed spreading and wetland creation. And so this is on the Monongahela Forest. Like I said, it's been going on for about 15 years. We planted over 1 million trees on this one site, about 600 hectares, so around 1,500 acres. We built over 2,000 wetlands. And we planted over 60 native species on this particular site. So this was a high elevation red spruce forest. At one time in the mid 1800s, there was somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million acres of red spruce forest in the highlands of West Virginia. Today there's 50,000. And so there's a big effort right now, the Central Appalachian Spruce Restoration Initiative, to put spruce back out on the landscape. Well, it happens that this particular mine site is at an elevation of 3,500 to 4,500 feet. So it's in that perfect place for red spruce restoration. And we've been partnering with the Forest Service since they called me actually in 2009, and they'd been trying to grow red spruce on the site, and it failed every time. But they weren't using any of these site preparation techniques. So I went over and we talked about it and we got them to do a pilot project at this place called Barton Bench of all things. And so we ripped up the site. They were very not so thrilled about the idea of going in and ripping it up. As you can see, it's pretty rough looking in the background. Ripped it up in 2010, planted it in 2011. And then we sort of been following the spruce on this site over the years. And here in 2022, I think I showed this picture earlier. The trees are now taller. This is a very slow growing tree, but they're doing really well. And on the 1,500 acres where we planted these, and the spruce has been about 50% of the mix, we have over 90% survival of these things. They just do really good. We have very little competition from invasive species. We think that has something to do with the elevation. But it's a real success story as far as the vegetation response. But also the other part of our program, this is Bill Moore. Bill Moore actually worked on the mine when it was a mine land. He lives in Bartow, West Virginia. And we kind of met him when he was looking for some work. And turns out he was a bulldozer operator. So local guy, didn't have to travel far. So we hired him for about 3 years to do around 100 acres a year of this ripping. And he was interviewed by a reporter who was writing a story for Yale 360. And his comment, I still love it to this day. He's like, every job I've ever had, if I did what I'm doing on this site, I would have been fired. But he was like, I totally see what they're trying to achieve, and I would do it no other way now. And so he worked until he retired, essentially. So we extended his career like 3 additional years. So that's where sort of the local economy bit comes into play. But putting on my professor hat at this particular site, we've had about 8 graduate students who've studied everything from salamanders in the wetlands to the native plant diversification to bats, looking at the response of the red spruce to various treatments and things of that nature. So we've had lots of good opportunities for graduate student research on this site. We've had dozens of undergrad interns and researchers and people coming out and actually getting some experience working on this site. We've also done actual job training too, as well. Through the Appalachian Conservation Corps, we bring in crews every year, teach them how to run a chainsaw, teach them how to plant trees, teach them how to do invasive species removal, a lot of native seeding, looking at these pictures. So there's lots of opportunities on these sites to provide training for young people. And as we're wrapping up the work on that site, because we've gone through the 1,500 acres now, we're starting to think about other opportunities. So recently we just completed 15 miles of mountain bike trails. We created about 30 campsites up on this site. And right now we're doing a project where we're decommissioning sediment basins that were put on by the mining company to collect sediment as it's running off the hill. We don't have any sediment anymore. And those ponds actually heat up during the summer and discharge to local headwater streams that support brook trout. And that's a form of thermal pollution. So we're just getting rid of the ponds and turning them into like small wetlands and replanting the whole thing to provide shade. And it's a really nice project. So other sorts of community engagement that we do, one of the big projects is at the Flight 93 National Memorial. And this was the flight that the passengers fought with the hijackers, and they ended up crashing in a field in Pennsylvania, near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. So this was the plane that was supposed to go to the Capitol building. And thankfully, those passengers were able to avoid that from happening. So in 2000 and, I think it was 10, I got contacted by the National Park Service. Well, it turns out that that site where the plane crashed was an old surface mine, about a 2,000 acre surface mine that was actually mined by a guy from Kentucky that we'd worked with in the past. And when you went down to the memorial area where they were building this wall with each of the names of the passengers, you were down sort of in a bowl along this hill slope, and there was not a tree in sight, as the picture shows on the top right. And so the Park Service had contacted us because it was a mine about coming in and creating a windbreak. And we were like, yeah, we can do that, but why don't we also engage like the families of the victims and a lot of business travelers, their companies, to come out and do a volunteer tree planting event. And so the Park Service like, well, we don't know about that. And I got some funding from somewhere else to do it the first year. And so the first year, it was just a huge success. One of the passengers was a member of BMW. BMW made $1 million donation to the National Park Service. So the next year, they were like, we'll take care of everything. You all take care of the planting. And I was like, all right, fair enough. So in 2013, I was there, and sometime in 2011, we were at Gettysburg, and we collected a seed from an eastern hemlock and grew it up in a greenhouse. And in 2013, we brought it to the site for the ceremony, and I guess I don't know if I did. Somebody presented it to the governor of Pennsylvania, who was wearing a suit and clearly wasn't going to be there to plant trees that day. So he handed it back to me and he's like, here, you can plant it. And standing next to me was Deborah Bodley. And she was the mother of Dora Bodley, who was the youngest passenger on the flight. And she had gone to New York for a play to visit her friend, and she was flying back to LA. And so I got Deborah and I was like, you here, come plant this tree with me. So we got the eastern hemlock out and planted it. And the idea was we were sort of linking these two Pennsylvania battlegrounds, Gettysburg and Flight 93 with this tree, which is the state tree for Pennsylvania. So Deborah, after we planted it, basically told me this is the first time she's felt whole since 2001 when the accident happened. And subsequently, she moved from LA to Pennsylvania so that she could be more involved in the activities that are going on at Flight 93. So here's the same tree in 2021, has little deer browse, but it's hanging in there. And I'm going back next week and I'll get another picture and update that. But we started that, Park Service didn't want to do that volunteer event, and I talked them into it. And we ended up doing it for 10 years. We planted, about 10,000 to 20,000 trees a year. And over that 10-year period, 150,000 trees were planted on that site, every one of them by a volunteer. So I thought that was a really, neat way to make it a living memorial. And so there was a saying that came out of that project: heal the land, heal the heart. And so that's sort of the motto of the Flight 93 memorial now. So there are some global initiatives that have started to, address this billion or trillion tree. There's the 1t.org campaign that we joined and pledged 10 million trees or something like that. And the United Nations has 2021 through 2030 as the ecosystem decade on ecosystem restoration. And we are the only active program in the United States that they recognize in this decade on ecosystem restoration. So in 2000, I was approached by the Arbor Day Foundation, who's been one of our partners for decades, and Mr. Beast, the YouTuber of all people, who was interested in planting 200,000 trees in Australia. And I had done a sabbatical over there in 2012 and started a little pilot project near the Wallamaya Forest. And I was like, yeah, I've got some connections. So using that idea and using this whole theme of global, reforestation, I applied for a Fulbright scholarship and got it and was able to go over between this period of 2020 and 2023. And we actually went to some active mine sites and they reclaimed their lands the same way we do. They put them in the grass, they compact them and put them in the grass. So we set up some pilot projects on a few mine sites. We worked with the Office of the Great Barrier Reef to do some riparian restoration over there. And we also looked at a carbon project to restore some marginal land, some overgrazed land, essentially is what it was. We had some volunteer events, so we tried to replicate what we were doing here in Appalachia. We had over 150 students participate. We engaged the traditional landowners in these projects. And thus far, in a couple of years, we've planted 300,000 trees in Australia. And I'll be going back probably next year to check on those. So I think it was a successful, we took this idea that a regional reforestation program and we've made it a global program now. So I'm getting ready to I have a grad student now who's working on a project in Namibia on a gold mine. So maybe we can also do some of this work in Africa as well. So in 2009, this week, I was at the UN in New York on a panel with Wangari Maathai and Prince Albert of Monaco talking about tree planting. There was a Plant for the Planet campaign to plant one tree for every person on the planet. And that year we actually, were successful in getting that goal. But she really kind of inspired me. And one of the quotes she has a whole bunch of really nice quotes, but I like this one. The act of planting a tree reconnects the human spirit to the beauty and importance of the natural world, the basis for all life on earth. So I'd like to acknowledge, we planted 8 million trees, we've done a lot of things, but we are a staff of 5 people. And Michael French, when I interviewed for this job in UK in 2002, he was an undergrad, and after my interview, he came up to me and he was like, if you get this job, I want to work for you. And well, he's been working with me ever since. He's now the director of operations of my nonprofit. He did his graduate work with me, and he's been employed by me in one way or the other forever. My wife, our mascot, Pinky, who's also our truffle hound, and Brianna, Anna, and Eric. We're kind of spread out all over the region, but it's really, at the end of the day, it's a lot of fun. And I've really enjoyed creating this project and seeing it, I think become a success. So if you want any more information, go to our website, greenforestwork.org, and we have lots of reports, more pictures, videos, all sorts of things. And I've got about 10 more minutes. I'll be happy to take some questions.
You did go back to that one slide where you had the quote from your African partner, and I wanted to get that down. I just didn't have it. I wasn't quick enough with my phone.
Oh, okay, yeah.
We've got microphones so that the
Yeah.
people on Zoom can hear.
Yeah. That's a great quote, like you said.
Yeah, I really like it. She was a very inspiring woman.
Exceptional, yeah.
Go ahead.
Hey, Michael with Trees Lexington and Tree Board. So this is amazing work that you're doing, and kudos. That's very inspiring. We are thinking and doing a lot of work about the urban forest, right? So what are maybe the implications and learnings that we can apply here? We certainly see a lot of compacted soil. So, but we can't exactly bring a giant bulldozer into some of these sites. They wouldn't like that too much. But what are some of the things that we can apply in the urban forest setting from what you've learned?
Yeah, so honestly, the site preparation thing is really important. And one of the big issues we have in our urban forests are dealing with those invasive species. And you've got a seed bank of honeysuckle and, all the nasties. And really overcoming that is a big problem, and trying to do that before you get, you try to plant your target species. So one of the things we also do on many of our sites, if they have a lot of invasives, we'll actually take a bulldozer and push all of it off. And we really have a lot of problems with this one shrub called autumn olive. And it's a prolific cedar and it loves nasty soils. So it's a real, issue to deal with. But I do think on some of these, compacted, park soils and things like that, even, some small tillage. And anytime you can add organic matter to a compacted soil, that's a good thing, in my opinion. So planting those trees, and that's another thing, thinking about the species of trees you plant. Just because you plant a bunch of trees now doesn't mean that has to be the ultimate final species. And one of the things we've learned on some of these areas where we have a lot of competition from these invasive shrubs is we might plant a fast growing conifer or a sycamore or something like that, with no intention of that ever being the final crop, but it will grow up and shade out that stuff. And then we can thin it and plant our oaks and our hickories and things like that. And that appears to be a strategy. A lot of people call that a nurse tree or nurse crop or something like that, that might have a lot of, use in the urban setting. But, the Reforest the Bluegrass is a really good program that, I was involved in 25 years ago. And some of those sites are turning out to be really nice. They got to go through this transition phase though, where they're sort of competing with the, the honeysuckle and the other invasives that are in there. But I think ultimately they'll win out, the natives. That's
Howdy there. So I've seen you've done a lot of work on sites that have just basically from field up. A lot of sites I've seen, like in the 80s, they just threw out a bunch of Virginia pine, and now it's just a bunch of stunted Virginia pine. Would you have any recommendations of how to manage that? Would you start from ground zero and push it all up, like you said, or?
Yeah, so the Monongahela site, the Mauer tract, it had two vegetation communities there. One was the grassland, but they actually did plant some trees out there, but they were red pine and Norway spruce. Don't want either of those. So what we did when we started that project, first thing we did was take the easy route, and we went and reforested all the grasslands. And then we started looking at all of this Norway, spruce. Even though it looks like a red spruce, ecologically it's different. So we started just knocking them down. And because they were not regenerating, they didn't produce cones or seed or anything like that. And we literally knocked them down with bulldozers and excavators and left them in place. And up there you get a lot of rainfall, so we weren't really worried about forest fires or anything like that. But it turns out that we did some research and showed this, that it was actually beneficial to do that because deer didn't like all that clutter. So we didn't get nearly as much deer browse. And when we did seed in native seed, those trees actually retained more moisture and they were breaking down and adding organic matter to the soil. And we saw higher success of areas that we seeded with the trees than we did without the trees. So yeah, the recommendation, as long as you're not in a real area that's prone to forest fires or something like that, would be to knock them down and take advantage of them decomposing over time and adding to that forest soil and providing some of those other benefits in the short term. Yes. Go ahead, in the blue.
So I was just curious on the mine reclamation sites, who owns that land? Did the mine company still own it? And then how did you get the money for these massive projects? Did they provide any resources or money themselves?
No, we didn't get any money from a mining company. So the land ownership on this is varied. lots of times the sites that we work on are what we refer to as legacy mine lands, where the mining company's long gone. And the land goes back to the original landowner, whoever that might be. It might be a land grant, it might be a land holding company. Lots of times in Appalachia, it's these land holding companies. There's quite a bit of mine land that's owned by federal and state governments. And we kind of like working on those because we know if we plant the trees, there might be some commitment to maintain them for the long term. So right now we have projects on the Monongahela, the Daniel Boone, the New River Gorge National Park, Flight 93. So a lot of federal land. And so because of that, our funding is varied. We do get federal grants. We get a lot of grants from foundations like the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, the Arbor Day Foundation. We have some industry sponsors like Komatsu. They like the idea of us using their equipment to go out and do this work. The bourbon industry has been supporting white oak plantings, and it took us a while to convince them you don't just plant white oaks, it can be 20% of the mix, but we want to, plant back a mix that's going to be like what was there before. We also have a lot of philanthropists who just like what we're doing and they write us checks and a lot of local people who, are interested in seeing their communities, revived. So our funds are varied and which is great because we wouldn't want to be reliant upon the federal government right now for all of our funds. That would not be a good thing. So it's just really interesting to see how that's all developed over time too. And I think with a lot of these initiatives, these large global reforestation initiatives, there's been a big push from corporate America to do more, corporate sustainability. And if you're a paper user or a big energy consumer and you can go plant trees to offset some of that, great. We also provide to several of our sponsors the opportunity for corporate building, team building, and they'll come, to West Virginia, 100 of them from Komatsu or wherever, and plant trees. And that's a really good thing to do from a corporate, team building perspective as well. Do we have time for one more? Yes.
I just personally want to say thank you. I mean, this is truly, I sat here and was just amazed and so thankful that you have put your talents and skills into this, and it's here in our state. Thank you very, very much.
Has there been any collaboration or communications with the Kentucky Department of Mine Reclamation and Enforcement to try and establish a procedure where those mining companies have to do more than just reseed with grass?
Oh yeah, we work very closely with them. And then one of the last things that President Obama did before he left office was pass the Stream Protection Act. And that was one of the first things that President Trump rescinded when he got in office. So we spent a lot of time working with Office of Surface Mining and our state agencies and took them out to these sites and showed them the trees and showed them the techniques and shared with them all of our research papers. And all of that was in this stream protection rule. And they referenced our papers even. And so we were really excited about that. And then, bam, it was gone. And we still do a lot of work. There is a thing called the Appalachian Regional Reforestation Initiative, which is made up of the state and federal agencies, and it still kind of meets. But that's the goal there, is to get, these are the active mines. Now, a lot of what we work on are what we call legacy mines, but there is still some activity on getting active mines to do reforestation. And there was great headways made in states like West Virginia, Tennessee, where nearly all of the active permits had forestry post-mining land use as a result of the Appalachian Regional Reforestation Initiative. The problem now is there's not a lot of mining going on. And so that's sort of come and gone. And that's why we're really focused on these legacy sites, because, there's hundreds and thousands of acres of these out there to work on.
We should probably wrap up. Join me one more time in thanking Dr. Barton.